Hello and welcome to Unleashed, the show that explores how to thrive as an independent professional. I'm your host, Will Bachman, and if you go to umbrex.com/unleashed, you can sign up for the weekly email, hear about all the other episodes we're doing on this now daily show. I'm very excited to be here today with Jessica Lackey. We're going to talk about sales and operations planning and some other stuff. Jessica, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Will. Thanks for having me on.
And I'll tell listeners that before we hit record here, we were having a private conversation about nutrition, and you were giving me all these great tips. You do some intermittent fasting, and I'm just kind of getting into it. So before we get into supply and operations planning, tell us, you also are, I think, a certified nutritionist. Do I have that right?
I'm a certified holistic nutritionist, and I'm also a certified life coach. So expanded my horizons beyond supply chain and SNOP.
All right. So I think that we should do a future episode on nutrition stuff because that was super helpful guidance. We're talking about breakfast and making sure I get plenty of protein. But let's talk about sales and operations planning. So I admit, a few years ago, I was in a meeting with a client and they were talking about the SNOP, and I had no idea what they were talking about. I had to sort of nod my head. I usually will ask people to say what they're talking about, but I didn't want to just look like an idiot. And so I looked it up, and now I know enough that it stands for sales and operations plan, but not much more than that. What is an SNOP? Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I'll give you the perspective from the past roles that I've had. So I've spent 7 years in a footwear and apparel company doing supply chain strategy planning and SNOP, which stands for sales and operations planning. And I spent 3 years in the appliance industry leading a SNOP team. So SNOP stands for sales and operations planning. You might hear it called SIOP, sales, inventory, and operations planning, or you also may hear their monthly process called IBP, Integrated Business Planning. These are all monthly processes to streamline one set of plans between demand, supply, and your inventory plans at the most basic levels. And as you grow in maturity to an integrated business planning process, it also encompasses additional strategic factors to make sure there's one aligned plan for an organization.
All right, fantastic. So walk me through that process.
Yeah, so I'll walk you through the more mature integrated business planning process because I think it's more comprehensive and more interesting. So it really starts with a strategic overview. What is the strategy for the company? Where do they want to grow? What segments, what customers they want to grow into? What investments are they making to support that? The next step is a product review. Do we have the right product portfolio to meet those strategic goals? Those steps are really concentrated in the more mature integrated business planning process. And then you get to the more nuts and bolts of the traditional SNOP processes, which is a demand review, a supply review, and a reconciliation review. Demand review is the process that says, what are we going to sell to our customers? So in the appliance industry is what we were going to sell to Lowe's, Home Depot, the appliance dealer channel, and footwear and apparel, it was what were we going to sell to Dick's Sporting Goods or Foot Locker. You ideally want to align on it at the lowest level of granularity you can, but at minimum aligning on what our high level demand forecast is going to look like, a sales forecast. You then move into a supply review that says, what supply do I need to either build or buy or transport to fulfill that demand? So if I'm in the appliance industry and I say I want to sell this many freezers across the spectrum of customers, what do I have in stock? How many do I need to make? And what does that mean from a capacity perspective? Back last year, if anyone tried to get a freezer, you may have noticed that you had a really hard time doing that during the beginning of COVID.
I did notice that, actually. Yeah, I bought a freezer, and it was a big, long wait. Everybody in the world was saying, "Oh, I want to buy a freezer and store my venison or just buy everything I can whenever it's available at the grocery store. Yeah.
Exactly. And if you're trying to buy a any kind of supply chain good right now in April of 2021, you're probably noticing that there's a lot of out of stocks because a lot of product is trapped in Long Beach with port congestion from China, and then trapped in or around the Suez Canal. So that's a supply review saying, in order to meet this demand, what do we need to build, buy, or transport? And then you have a reconciliation process, both financially and unit-wise, to say, we have this demand, we have this, what we can build, make, or build, buy, or transport. Where do we have gaps? And in some cases, you have not enough demand to fill your supply capacity. So you've got manufacturing plants you need to keep running, but yet demand is not there to fulfill that, to max out that capacity. Or in the case of freezers last year, you have much more demand than you have supply. And then the process then says, okay, how do we reconcile this? What levers do we need to pull, either on the demand side or the supply side, to decrease demand, increase demand, decrease supply, or increase supply? Once those decisions are made, then it's handed off to presented to the executive team that says, here's the current landscape of demand and supply, and here's the trade-offs that we need to make in order to have demand match supply. In the integrated business planning aspect, you're also connecting that to your financials, because you may say, well, I've got demand appropriately balanced with supply, but yet it's not meeting our financial targets. So what are we going to do about that scenario?
Okay. Wow. So there's a lot here to discuss. So maybe walk me through a typical month as a sales and operations planning executive, like in one of the roles that you've had. I imagine there's a sort of monthly rhythm of tasks that you go through.
Yes, there is. So in organizations, you sometimes find that you have an SNOP leader who sits outside of a function to really orchestrate the process. And sometimes it's just embedded as a role within the supply chain, typically. But there's usually a week or two of a demand review. So looking at your historical sales, your accuracy on those sales, the upcoming forecast and events that you have, promotions or big events that typically are around the corner. So you reforecast your demand sales. They say, what's my one set of numbers for demand? Then a week later, you layer that into the supply picture to say, again, what demand do I need? What supply do I need to make that demand? And then you have a week to reconcile those plans and come up with a recommendation for your leadership team before your monthly management review. So it's definitely a rigor of, within 2 weeks, you have a demand review. Next week is a supply review. Next week is a reconciliation review. And then you start the cycle again with a product review, keeping all your launch plans in hand.
So that's the kind of ideal picture of things. Talk to me about some of the issues that come up, or if a client was looking for help on their sales and operations planning process, what might be some of the things that they're facing?
Sometimes the problems start culturally, where there's no leadership engagement. So that's a big challenge, where players on the ground are seeing these major issues, but leadership isn't really engaged, or holding functions accountable. Because a lot of times the demand process is managed by sales. And if you've got a sales organization that culturally has a bias for over delivering to their promises, and always beats their forecast because they're sandbagging, that causes havoc within the supply chain. So it starts with cultural. Do we have leaders that believe in this process? Do we have leaders that are going to hold their teams accountable for participating in the process and learning and adjusting when their plans go differently than expected? Another challenge is systems. So it's very challenging to do an SNOP process on a spreadsheet. But a lot of companies start there and do that. So getting end-to-end integration is really challenging. And the third challenge I see mostly is that it's requires a fair amount of diligence to really make decisions and really activate these trade-offs. And that requires a fair amount of organizational commitment and muscle in the process.
Talk to me about systems. So you mentioned it's really difficult to do in a spreadsheet. What are some of the systems that companies use for this? What's that look like?
The landscape's pretty wide and varied based on the needs of the company. So I'll name some of the big players. There's Kinaxis, there's SAP IBP, there's Anaplan. There's a company called Blue Yonder that used to be JDA. I think I'm reading about a company called E2 Open, and those are just the ones that I know that have that do all segments of the planning process. There are other companies that I'm not as familiar with. Logility does forecasting. I think Oracle has some products. So there's a lot of systems out there. And this is, again, where it goes into the strategy component of this. If a company really wants to invest in a good SNOP process and an integrated end-to-end planning process, there needs to be commitment from the IT organization for clean master data, good system setup, and a willingness to invest in integrating all these systems. Because without, it's a monthly process at the executive level, but then it enables daily and weekly planning at the tactical operator level.
Is this something that's typically done at, it sounds like it would be done at the business unit level, the high level, and then is something like this replicated at the plant level? So, you work for a major appliance company. I guess you're doing this overall for the whole United States, but then is that process at an individual plant, are they just doing something similar?
Yeah. At a plant level, normally it's done by it's a bottoms up, top down reconciliation. So all the planning is done at an item level, rolled up to a plant, or rolled up to a division level. So really, you're looking top down at the total at the executive level, but it's based on a bottoms up process. We would end up doing this for cooking products, refrigeration and freezer products, dish care and fabric care, but we would be looking across our entire source base. So in some cases, you have capacity in one facility and not in another facility. So the question is, what products are made in facility A versus facility B, and how can you take the demand that you have and leverage your plant base? Or sometimes it's a make versus a buy decision. You have some manufacturing that's, that you own, but then you have a surge of demand, and can you leverage overseas capacity, or vice versa? So it's done at a holistic level, but it's generated from a bottoms up view. I would say it's normally not, you normally do it within a geography and then maybe within a division or business unit, but then there's also a global roll up, particularly when you're talking about supply chain and raw materials. There's a chip shortage right now. There's some challenges in resins. And so then you actually at an executive global level need to be saying, from a global purchasing perspective, where do I most need to send my supply given the demand and the current supply situation in a given geography?
I was surprised. So I served a small manufacturing company for a while, one of my clients, and they had maybe a couple hundred SKUs, and some of them we would produce to stock. Some of them would we only produce to order because they were more like special orders. And they only had maybe 4 different production lines, but I was kind of astounded at how even this sort of $10 to $20 million revenue company, it got so fiendishly complicated, figuring it out because of it, and at the level of, okay, what are we going to produce next? What are we producing today? Of figuring out this process of which orders do we want to produce today? Because if you go from product A to product B, there might be a shorter changeover from product A to product C, and you're trying to sequence things, and also you're based on, what inventory we have currently in stock. Oh, we're out of this bottle, so we can't produce this particular product. And it just becomes this like massively complicated problem where you're trying to, shift things around and figure out like, okay, now how does the changeover times work now? Do we have the right, do we have to set up the whole machines again? Do we have the right inventory in stock to produce these things? Which clients are yelling the loudest because their stuff is late, and how important is this client? So it was like really complicated problem that you could almost solve by hand for a company that size. But I imagine that as you get more and more complex, and you're talking about multiple plants, multiple divisions, multiple products, are companies using sort of artificial intelligence or Monte Carlo simulation to, just sort out all the different combinations of which plant's going to produce what, or is it still like somewhat manual? How is that process done?
Yeah, so that's where systems come into play. All these advanced planning systems have algorithms and heuristics to help you plan. Again, SNOP is really the kind of, I would say, the mid to long range. SNOP doesn't get into necessarily the nitty gritty of production scheduling, though many of these those supplier the systems that they also get into production scheduling. But really, the systems help. It's a tremendous help, and there's machine learning, AI on forecasting. There's response algorithms and heuristics that run on the supply side, but it's also so critically important to start with process and people. You shouldn't have to wait to know which customer is screaming the loudest before you know who's strategically important to serve and what are our service level agreements for them. Maybe it's okay that this customer who's small, who only orders low margins, special order things, maybe it's okay that they scream. And how do we strategically set out that? What are the most important products to make? Where do we make our money? And maybe it's okay if we lose a sale no one wants to lose business, but how is there organizational alignment on the most important products, the most important customers, and the high level operational plan before you even get into the specific nitty gritty on changeovers? But that's really the SNOP process, to say, what's the operational plan we want to align to, and then you get into the day-to-day tactical scheduling, which systems definitely help with that.
Walk me through the reconciliation process in a little bit more detail. I think we can sort of intuitively understand what the demand forecasting process would look like, and the supply review process. What do we have out there? What do we need to produce? But that reconciliation process, give me some case examples of some trade-offs or decisions that you make. You can sanitize it if you want, but of really getting into the nitty-gritty of what that process looks like and some of the decisions that are happening.
Okay. So I'll example from apparel. We have this is years ago, but let's say that the sales plan for fleece is higher than the demand plan or the supply plan for fleece. And the only way we're going to meet our financial targets is by satisfying this demand plan, but there is no supply. It could be a factory has no capacity. It could be a materials problem. It could be that they can make it and we can't ship it here. So really the reconciliation process is the process to say, where do we have a demand supply gap? What are the levers we can pull? Can we, especially given a time horizon? So if it's a year out that we know that our demand plans can outstrip supply, can we certify a second supplier? For materials, can we certify a second plant? Can we add capacity to a given plant? Can we add overtime to the plant that we have? Can we run our factories more efficiently to get more rate out? And what are the financial trade-offs and the operational trade-offs that are used to make that decision? So it could be that, well, we can't certify a second supplier, but we could air freight supply from a different partner, and that financial trade-off is X versus Y. Or it would cost us this much money to invest in certifying a second or getting extra capacity. And then you look and say, well, maybe that doesn't make a lot of financial sense. So let's look at demand. What if we actually chose not to satisfy all this demand and instead segmented our products where we are only selling it to the customers where we make the most money? So really you're doing a top down, like a financial on each of the scenarios from a demand perspective, decreasing demand, but by increasing price, or by selling to only profitable customers, or increasing supply, and really looking at the operational trade-offs of an ease of doing that based on their time horizon, or looking at the financial cost of the options. That's why it's so critically important for organizations to invest in not just leaving this as part of the supply chain, but by putting it in a place of influence across sales, merchandising, marketing, because you could, at the same time as we're having the supply constraint on fleece, your marketing team could be creating like this bang up marketing campaign that, you're looking and say, well, I'm not going to have enough product to support all this kind of lift you're doing for this market, this marketing campaign. So why would we spend the money on a marketing campaign for products that we know we will be out of stock on? Or that could be a strategic initiative for the company, is to be out there, be out of stock, and create that demand for more products ongoing. So that's the trade-off reconciliation part, where you need to have organizational commitment to the plan forward.
Yeah, so that's an example where you'd have more demand than you think you can supply with your current factories. You mentioned like a year timeline. What are the different time horizons that you are operating under when you do a sales and operations plan? Are there some explicit, like, okay, here's our 1 month plan, our 6 month plan, our 1 year plan? Or talk to me about that a bit.
So your SNOP process typically is, 2 to 20. It's a rolling 24-month plan. In your next, I would say 3 months, it's really a tactical sales and operations execution plan, which gets into the much more SKU level, it gets into the production scheduling pieces. And beyond 24 months, it's a more of a strategic plan for the company. Where are we strategically going to invest? Where do we strategically need to add capacity or customers? But really a best-in-class SNOP process is a rolling 24 months. But definitely companies want to strive to get out of they want to get out of the next 90 days at minimum.
What's the typical training and background of someone who's in a sales and operations planning role?
It can really depend. A lot of them rise through the ranks of supply chain and planning, but we see a lot of SNOP leaders also come from finance. The really important, and there are some companies. Oliver White is a great example of a companies that really do great SNOP training, and integrated business planning training. But SNOP is not really taught, and there's elements to the SNOP process as being the leader of the organization where you need to be incredibly aware of the nuances of the business and really have some political authority to help run decisions to the ground. So it's as much about training on the process, which you said is not traditional, not terribly complicated to understand, but it requires a lot of process rigor, requires a lot of decision, kind of helping decisions get made in facilitation, and keeping tabs on a fair amount of moving parts within the business.
And what are the skill sets required? You mentioned that it's not really taught anywhere. What are some of the skills required to be a great sales and operations planning leader?
There's the business acumen pieces. I think, knowing how to read a P&L, understanding the basics of demand and supply, because you want to have good sales leaders and demand planning leaders that know demand, and you want to have a good leaders on the supply side that truly understand supply capabilities. But the SNOP leader needs to be a strategic thinker, aware of all of the SNOP, the pillars of the processes, financially savvy, but ultimately a good communicator and a way to see the forest through the trees and drive to action. So actually being an SNOP, actually former consultants are probably fantastic at being SNOP leaders, even if they're not functionally trained in each of the underlying each of the underlying pillars, because it's really not about functional excellence. It's about driving cross-functional decision making, which is a skill set of many of the listeners of this podcast.
I'm curious what sorts of consulting project opportunities there are in this space. Can you think of any cases where you engaged consultants, or you've seen other firms engage consultants on SNOP kind of projects?
Yeah, there's a lot of consultants that, that mid market, that manufacturer that you talked about. That would be a perfect case example of a company that could use SNOP processes. I think there are, from an independent consulting perspective, I think there's a huge market for that mid market zone of don't really want to invest in high end systems, but need the cultural thinking around the SNOP process. At my experience has been that when you're missing customer deliveries, you're having really high supply chain cost, when you have high inventory, really reduced financial performance below what you think you should have, and financial surprises, those are the indicators that say this could be a problem with our planning and SNOP processes. That would be an indication of let's look under the hood here. So, my companies that I've been at have engaged consultants to help with SNOP when they've got these symptoms of a non-integrated process. Right now, I would say that any company that has found themselves in a supply chain pinch due to COVID should really invest in relooking at the integrated planning process and saying there might be strategic decisions we've made for cost, the single sourcing of suppliers or moving things to overseas, that maybe should be relooked at and could impact the SNOP process. If we choose to multi-source, move manufacturing to be more resilient, that has an impact on the SNOP process, and maybe consultants could help diagnose that for companies.
Yeah. If you're brought in by a client and asked to do a diagnostic of their sales and operations planning process, let's say that the executives just sense that there's some problem because things are working out, but everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else. So they don't know exactly what the root cause or the problem is. Walk me through what your diagnostic would be, and what data are you looking at? What questions are you asking? Who are you talking to?
Yeah, so from a who you're talking to perspective, you're talking to the whoever owns the P&L, because they're the ones that make decisions. You're talking to your sales leader, your operations and supply chain leader, your product leader. You're probably merchandising. That's who you're talking to. And then you're also talking to supply chain, typically where it lives in finance. From a data perspective, you're looking at both the lagging indicators, so inventory, demand forecast accuracy. You're looking at your service metrics for your customers to say what's the level of, you're looking at transportation as a percentage of sales, typically. From a diagnostic perspective, you're looking at culture and leadership engagement, people, process, and tools. From a people perspective, you're looking at the skill set of the players on the ground. Have they been trained in their function? And are they, what's their fluency with systems and starting to get to that advanced machine learning perspective for some companies? From a process perspective, you're looking at the functional pillars of, do we do a product review, a demand review, a supply review? Do we have the building blocks functionally, and do we have the cross-functional integration? And then you're looking at tools. Do we have systems at each of these functional pillars, but don't have a cross-functional system, or are we just gapping on systems across the board?
Fantastic. Well, Jessica, if people wanted to follow up with you and get in touch, where would you point them?
I'd point them to LinkedIn, Jessica Lackey. I'm, as an independent consultant, also partnering with some colleagues in the footwear and apparel space to be the operational experts end-to-end in footwear and operations. So you can find more information about me, and you can also find more information about the colleagues I'm working with in the footwear and apparel space.
Fantastic. Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining today, telling us about SNOP. I feel a lot smarter about it now. And for listeners who are so inclined to give this show a 5-star review on iTunes, that would be really much appreciated. It does help people discover the show. Jessica, thanks again for joining.
Thank you.